So, thank you very much. First of all, to Herbert and to Hans sorry for not replying to your email for about 3 months, but it all worked out. And, and also to all the organisers of this European Social Week. You know, Hayek, the economic philosopher, used to say that if you put the word social in front of something, it not only destroyed the meaning of the next word, but opposed it entirely. So, for example, social democracy means that there's neither a concept of the social nor of democracy. You can see the power of the idea. So the social week obviously is not off to a good start, so it only lasts for 3 days. So, but I really hope that that we can refute Hayek over the next few days, and I'm really genuinely honoured to be invited. Catholic social thought really transformed my understanding of the world and also the possibility of how to act in the world, and gave to me the very possibility of a politics that could resist the domination of the market without resourcing exclusively to the administrative methods of the state. As a Jew, I would also like to say that I take this invitation as a great act of generosity and another opportunity to express my gratitude to the Christian tradition of the common good and political economy for giving me a public life of meaning and of purpose. Now, one of the great things I took from reading the encyclicals, and this begins in Rerum Novarum, is the idea of paradox. And you know, a paradox is something that sounds wrong and is right. So that's a paradox. And I don't think you can really do politics without doing paradox. So an example of a paradox would be that you can only have a competitive economy if you have very strong patterns of cooperation. So cooperation is necessary for competition. But the paradox developed by Leo XIII and all the way through the encyclicals, which is very relevant for this week, was the idea that the old is the new. All the way through, it's the old is the new. And what he meant by that is by beginning with the wisdom of the Bible and of Aristotle, that this new thing, this Rerum Novarum, capitalism, it's only by drawing on an ancient wisdom, on an old wisdom, that we can begin to understand, humanize, and domesticate this beast. And the idea is that capitalism does have, and it's good to remember that it does have, a manic tendency to uproot, disrupt, and subordinate. So, you know, we talk about all these crises, you know, you can't be in a permanent crisis. After a while, that becomes normal. And this whole idea that a human being can move anywhere across space and time just to get higher wages, this is an idea of what capitalism does. It commodifies the person. So, and it turns creation itself, and this is the crucial bit of the old that is the new, and I hope will shape your thought over the next few days. Capitalism turns creation itself, human beings and nature, into a commodity, and that this can only be resisted by strengthening relationships, institutions, and a sense of vocation through a politics of the common good. So I'm often criticised. I'm criticised for many things, both in everywhere I go, really, at home, you know, at work. But I'm often criticised in the party that I'm in, the Labour Party in England, for working so closely with faith groups and particularly with the church. And I always reply that at least Christians don't think that the free market created the world. Right? And it's an important insight to remember. But sometimes when I'm in the mood, not that often these days, I add that neither did the state create the world. That those two things have to be resisted. There's something inherited that was not created by us, but was received, that constitutes us, which is creation. And it is a real delight to me to be able to talk to people who don't just stand up and shout at me when I say things like this, and the opportunity to embrace the idea of creativity and creation, which requires us to be both faithful and transgressive. And that's another paradox, I would say. You can only really be faithful if you are transgressive. So this is the crucial terrain of the battle ahead. The talk that I was given was the power of ideas. And I have to say very sadly that the opposite of what my mother taught me was true. She said when I was demoralized and unhappy, she would say, and I don't know if this is translatable into any other language, where there's a way, there's a will. She'd say, you know, you've got to find a way, you've got to be determined. But in politics, and in particular the time where we are in, it's the other way round. Only where there's a way is there a will. I just see people completely exhausted from initiatives and doing things that don't lead anywhere. And certainly we've lost a sense of direction. And we can see this throughout our continent in different national and local forms. Because the domination of capital is unbearable, because the free movement of people to move around and be treated as commodities everywhere they go, because this unmediated movement of people, money and things, it is unbearable. It leads to exploitation, the degradation of nature, and it becomes a threat to the security, stability, and even the possibility of a loving family life. And as was mentioned earlier, the alternatives presented to this, nationalism, state control, administrative direction, are not constructive alternatives. They're not creative alternatives. They're alternatives from the past. For many, it feels as if there is no way and that there is a drift towards depression. So the battle of ideas that we're talking about right now is actually a battle over sanity itself. What is it sane to think? What is it reasonable to believe? Common sense, the way of the world, the fundamental assumptions about what works, what a human being is, what is reasonable, this is what shapes the possibility of shaping the world, of creating this, what you called a radical evolution, of exerting legitimate power over others. That's where the power of ideas lies, and it starts in a battle over what is mad and what is not. So I've come to bring you good news and bad news. But being Jewish, I'll start with the bad news. You know, for us, it's better to begin there. It's always better to begin there. And the bad news is that the Christian inheritance, and in particular the Catholic political economy, has become a marginal force over the past 40 years. A supplement, an addendum. It hasn't constituted the debate. And just as society has been besieged by the commodifying power of the market on the one side in the name of efficiency, and the homogenizing power of the state on the other in the name of justice, so it has been that Catholic social thought has been marginalized by free market economics and state theories of welfare and justice. To put names to them, by Hayek and by Keynes. And Catholic social thought and Christian democracy does not constitute a sensible and compelling alternative to the status quo. It is not alive in people's hearts. It is not singing a winning song. A constructive role for trade unions, a form of corporate governance in which workers are properly represented on the boards, a system of regional banks and a vocational economy play very little role in either the European or the national debates. To make matters worse, and this, I really appreciated what Maurice said earlier because it made me look a little less mad. The European Union is perceived as a remote administrative organisation that intensifies free movement and commodification. It's a force for homogenisation and in fact is deeply anti-political. So to paraphrase Gramsci, the new is dead, but the old is yet to be born. And so all manner of morbid symptoms pertain: Islamism, nationalism, and a disgusted rejection of the prevailing system with no constructive alternative in sight. We know the power of ideas, and at the moment the tendency is to lead to isolation, depression, and polarization, and these are not our ideas. So only where there's a way is there a will, and at the moment there is no way, and a sense of besieged drift is at work. You could almost call it a permanent crisis. a politics that can't change anything, and a lack of common purpose. The situation is serious and made worse by the fact that my generation was brought up to believe that nothing was serious, that either the market or the state or basically grown-ups would sort out all this stuff, that religion was declining, that racism was ending, that peace and prosperity were guarantees, that borders didn't matter anymore. Do you remember that one? It doesn't matter anymore, and suddenly we've had to really begrudgingly recognize that the old is the new, that we have to recognize the realities of these things. Fundamentally, I was brought up in a political sense with no sense of tragedy or loss, and the present realities are all a bit shocking. Anyway, that's the bad news. The good news is that the fundamental ideas of human nature, of history, and of reason that are carried within the Catholic social thought and the labour movement that it shaped and it nurtured are the best ideas for our time, with the right blend of radicalism and conservatism, the old and the new, of tradition and modernity, vocation and innovation. So we are living in paradoxical times, and yours is a paradoxical tradition that is to be treasured. And the renewal of these ideas will require a paradoxical blend of humility and courage, faithfulness and transgression, a certain stubborn creativity that can be guided by the fundamental ideas that are as beautiful as they are powerful, as simple as they are complex, as old as they are new. So what are these ideas? Let us begin with the fundamental one of human nature, of what we as people are actually like. So, as far as I'm concerned, this tradition that we belong to does not begin with the opposition that dominates the conflict between left and right, which is the idea that people are either competitive or cooperative, selfish or altruistic, individual or communal. It took me 30 terribly long years of studying and teaching in universities and attending too many seminars and talks on these themes to realize that this can never be resolved, and that there's not much point of asking it in that way to start with. And it took Catholic social thought to make me realize that it is best to begin somewhere else, and that is with the idea that the human being is a social being, with a natural tendency to realize themselves through relationships and through work. So we inherit language, parents, faith, a sense of place. This is true of all of us and particular to each of us. These parents, this faith, this place. Each person is capable of sin and grace, good and evil. And as social beings, a large part of what determines who we become is given by the incentives to vice or incentives to virtue that exist in the society that we are born into. If there is a reward for selfish and greedy behavior, then that will predominate. If there is a real reward for faithfulness and skill, then that too will grow in strength. That is the central idea, that we are social beings who need each other to flourish. We are dependent beings with a tendency to liberty, to live our life from within, according to commitments that are our own, but those very commitments are also inherited, and their strength is is fundamental to our flourishing. So central to my understanding of human nature are that love and work are of fundamental importance to people, and that both are captured by the idea of labour. In English, and once again I don't know how this translates, when a woman has a child it is called being in labour. The act of birth, the care and compassion required for family life are captured by this term labour. And the same is true of work, which is the transformation of the external world through the application of expertise, knowledge and energy. That's a better definition than the one I worked with for many years. I used to define work as basically something I didn't want to do. So that works out better. But I haven't forgotten the first definition. So both meanings of labour, family and work, involve difficulty, tiredness, pain and suffering. I am sometimes rendered almost paralysed by the thought of my family and my work. My arms ache, my heart breaks, and I'd really prefer to watch the television and eat a pre-cooked meal on my own. So central to this idea, I think, is that we are constituted by inheritance, pain and relationships. That is who we are. And that is why I called the political form of these ideas blue labour, as in Miles Davis' Kind of Blue, or the blues. Love and work are bloody and demanding, and they are necessary. In both of them, they can be full of vice or virtue. Family life can be abusive, faithless and damaging, or it can be loving, faithful and supportive. It is invariably a mix of these things, or on the spectrum, as contemporary psychologists like to say. But the role of politics is to give incentives to the good, incentives to the virtue. And it is vital that this is at the centre of what we say. There are no easy answers. This will not be resolved by a consumer answer or a welfare answer. The answer involves participation, improvisation, the active reconciliation of estranged interests, the building of relationships where none exists, a relentless negotiation, a defence of humanity through a vocational democracy. So one of the great things about Catholic social thought is that it is not utopian. It begins with the idea that we are fallen, by your sweat shall ye live, and so it already factors in sin, interests, toil and trouble into the anthropology. Another way of putting this is that without the modest virtues, those of honesty, faithfulness, diligence, courage, patience and compassion, there will be no big changes, only more of the same, a different kind of managerial tyranny. State, market, it will be the same. So we can assert, I think, that we have a thick and complex view of human beings, that we are social beings, capable of love and grace, just as much as selfishness and isolation. But the way it goes in the battle between vice and virtue is down to the incentives that exist in society, and that pretty much is what politics is about, the conditions under which people can flourish together. Then there is the second great truth that follows from this, and it is good to remember it, which is that you cannot do it on your own. However much you work on your CV and all those things, you cannot live and you cannot have a fulfilling life on your own, that the realization of your own creativity can only be achieved with others, with the support of others, and that's also what it means to be social beings. And this brings us to rerum novarum, to this new thing, this capitalism. And this is the third crucial part in the battle of ideas. The key point here is to argue with reason that human beings and nature are not commodities, that bereft of protective institutions, of a sense of place, of earning and belonging, then the local democratic and vocational solidarities, which are complex and embedded, will not lead actually to individual isolation, but will be replaced by more abstract and general forms of solidarity in the forms of nations, peoples and empires. I think this is what you were referring to about nationalism. And this is where the wisdom of subsidiarity is to be found, locating power and authority close to people and amenable to democratic control rather than distant and remote. I think if we learned anything from the financial crisis, it was that accountability is too important to be left to accountants. There's got to be some form of relational accountability, of face-to-face accountability, and Mitbestimmung and other forms of corporate governance representation ensure that. People will never and have never simply viewed themselves as an economic unit. There is more to life than that. So when the politics and economics of our society become managerial, procedural and abstract, people feel abandoned. People really feel abandoned. So there's this sense of rage that I experience in England against my party, Labour. And it's not for any particular policy, it's for the sense of abandonment, that it is known that people no longer feel that we represent their culture and their interests. So in my experience in community organising with London citizens, we did build a common good, a common campaign between Catholic and Protestant congregations. I'm letting you know it can be done. Sunni and Shia mosques, unions and local groups, religious and secular, around the pursuit of a living wage, the idea that people should be paid enough to live. And it was a remarkable experience for me. First, that it was led by faith communities. Second, that it was led by the poor. This is something that we've really missed, the leadership of the poor in our politics. You know, I'm just letting you know, as an academic, the last people who should lead you are people who've been to university. You know, it doesn't work out. So the idea of faith community leadership, of the leadership of the poor. Second, that on the issue of the dignity of labour, of work and of family life, each of the traditions, each of the communities could find some sense of ownership of the cause and find within their traditions a reason to support. The idea that there is more to the human being than utility is a central part of the power that our ideas have. It is vital, however, not to conceive ideas as abstract and generalized principles that need to be imposed. The idea of the common good is built around practices and built around the primacy of relationships, of love, with all the complications, of developing reciprocity rather than domination as the core value of society. So it's to take the social dialogue to a social practice where the resistance to managerial domination comes from within the labour movement itself and its participation in the economy. So one could almost say that relationships, reciprocity and responsibility are the core trinity of the new politics. So in applying these ideas, it is necessary to notice what we have lost by the European Union becoming about the unhindered movement of people, money and things, and not about how it began, with co-determination in corporate governance, a stress on vocation in the labour market, and with regional banks that functioned. So the paradox of contemporary European politics is that the country with the greatest degree of labour representation in its corporate governance structure, the most intense system of vocational interference in labour market participation, and the greatest degree of constraint on finance capital in its banking system generates the greatest value and is the most competitive within the international economy. Another way of saying the same thing is that while Catholic social thought has been vindicated in its practices of a balance of interest, the importance of place, the preservation of status, solidarity and subsidiarity in the organisation of the economy itself, it has yet to be articulated as an organised political force. So one of the disadvantages of being a politician as opposed to an academic these days is that I realise that I really should stop. So I'm going to skip a few pages of the talk because I really think it is important to allow other people to speak. So the way I'll conclude is that in terms of our idea of what a person is, of what it means to be human, then our inheritance is strong. And there is great work that we can do and that only we can do with the inheritance that we have. When it comes to our theory of history, that those societies based on a diverse range of institutions that uphold the dignity of labour within the economy, then I would also say that we are strong, that unions and universities and vocational institutions have a constitutive role to play in our economic organisation. When it comes to history, I would say that the post-war German social market did reconcile Catholic and Protestant bosses and workers around an idea of the common good, and it worked. But it's also good to remember that under the prevailing EU legislation, it could be that the social market itself becomes illegal, that these are interferences in free movement, these are interferences within the economy, and that Germany could actually lead the move to its own disintegration. You could say that the tragedy of contemporary Europe is that Germany remains misunderstood as exclusively fiscally conservative when that was only one aspect of its economic system. And so it's for that reason that the European Union does appear as a technocratic and administrative system, detached from the civic institutions that give our continent life, our free cities, universities, churches, and vocational institutions that embody traditions of self-government over many centuries, and promotes, in contrast, as its highest priority, the free movement of capital and labour within its sphere. I mean, I've got a similar dilemma to Maurice. People always ask me, you know, oh, we've got a referendum coming in Britain, and they say, are you for or against? And, you know, if it wasn't for the company, if it wasn't for the people who were against, I'd be much more tempted. You know, that's a relational issue. So what I would say to you in real conclusion is that our ideas will have no power unless we can tell a plausible story of why they work, how they work, and why they are better than our rivals. There is a lot at stake in getting this right, but I thank you again for the invitation to speak to you today. Thank you very much.